Welcome to Ideas in Action, the official University of Southern California podcast. This show was recorded live on USC's campus.
Thanks so much for being here. It's always a pleasure to be at the festival, and I'm delighted to moderate this panel with three professors, friends, colleagues, and former students. We're going to have our discussion that'll carry us through 45 minutes or so, probably, and then we're going to invite you all to pose questions. And in doing so, we'll have you come down and use the microphones in sequence. And I'll just make a little quick plug. We're academics. There is no stupid question. There's no dumb question. You can ask anything you want. There is such a thing as a long question. So try to steer away from those so we can hear from as many people as possible. I do want to also make a quick note as a beloved, the Los Angeles Times Festival of Books is a beloved community event. I'm thrilled to be part of it again. I'm a 30-year subscriber to the Los Angeles Times, and the paper version. And I just would urge the Los Angeles Times to come to a fair and equitable agreement with their employees so we can continue to serve all of us in journalism. Thank you. So I'm going to introduce our panelists and then start off with some questions. I've encouraged them to talk to one another. We're talking about placemaking and the politics of land, of landscape infrastructure. These are far-flung topics across geographies, somewhat mirrored in time and chronology, and I know our creative authors will find ways to talk with one another as well. So I've urged them to do that. So let me introduce them to you one at a time. I'll keep the introduction short. Immediately to my left is Professor Alex Robinson, right here from our School of Architecture. Alex is a noted thinker about landscapes in Southern California in particular. He's got a lot of very creative irons in the fire about the work he does. We'll start the talk mostly about one book, and then I've invited Alex to range across his curiosity of landscapes and power and politics. My colleague in the history department, Joanne Flores Villalobos, is an historian of 19th and 20th century, the global South, the Caribbean, corporate and financial and capitalism history, labor and women. She has a really thoughtful, interesting first book, which we're going to get into here, that focuses in on the construction of the Panama Canal. So it's a delight to welcome my friend and colleague Joanne to the panel. And then Julia Ornelas Higdon is a professor from Channel Islands, Cal State Channel Islands, who did her PhD here with us about a decade ago. And I'm thrilled to have Julia here. She's the author of a very new book, 6 months out, something like that? 6 months out. So I'm thrilled to see Julia's work take that step towards publication in hard copy. And Julia's here to talk about wine, grapes, and labor, race, politics, and land across 18th and 19th century and early 20th century California. So with that, let me tell you the title of the books we're going to focus on, and I'm not going to offer the subtitle because I'd like our authors to say, and it's subtitled this because this is what it's really about, okay? Before I do that, let me just invite each of them in sequence fairly quickly. What's your job? Alex, what do you do?
Thanks, Bill. That's a good question. I am a landscape architecture professor in the School of Architecture, and it's a master's program. So I teach a small cohort of people that are interested in landscape architecture, and it's a professional degree, so we teach them how to actually be landscape architects. And you have to go to a certain kind of school to get accreditation, and that has accreditation to get a license. So I teach them a whole variety of things ranging from the basics of this semester. I teach them how to grade topography and draw contours that you see on maps, drain things, create hills and swales. I also teach them how to design. So I do an introductory design studio where we go out to Catalina Island and learn about landscape and learn what to love about landscape and what we might think about when we design landscape and how to make interventions into the landscape. So I spend a lot of time, and then I also do research, so I could go on and on. I'm going to keep it short, but I do a little bit of teaching, a little bit of research, and we do service as well, which is a whole other topic.
One quick follow-up question. In any given week, what percentage of your day are you outside?
That's good. I think I am outside, what percentage? Maybe 15%.
Okay. Joanne, what's your job?
Hello. It's a little worrisome when your boss asks you what your job is, I feel. So I'm
not taking notes.
He should know. I'm an assistant professor in the history department here at USC, and I teach classes on U.S. empire, Latin America, women's and gender history, Afro-Latin America, race, etc. And similarly, I research on all of those topics. So my book is about the Panama Canal, but very much about race, empire, women, gender. So those are the two main things I do.
Teaching right now?
I am teaching right now. I'm teaching the big History of Latin America survey from the indigenous past to, what happened last week. So it's a lot.
Great. Thank you. Julia.
So I teach at Cal State Channel Islands. This academic year, I have the extreme privilege and joy of being on sabbatical. So that means I've been doing research. What does that look like? Sometimes we don't understand it. A lot of time in archives, reading old documents, reading books, catching up on all the literature I missed, all the new books I missed because I was teaching. When I'm not on sabbatical, I teach in the areas of U.S. history, California history, the West. I also teach Chicano and Chicana history. I'm affiliated with that department. Like my colleague here, Joanne, I teach big surveys, only they're U.S. focused. And one of my greatest joys in teaching that survey is to have students who come in and say, I hate U.S. history. I'm only here because I need this class to graduate. I know there's people in this room, right, who might hate history. And it's my great joy to turn that around, right, and find the fun and the drama in United States history, and it's not hard to find.
Great. So let's start with you, Julia. All three of our authors, the books we're centering on, have very captivating first titles that in many respects don't tell you a thing about what the book's about. It's just a captivating title. So I'm going to offer the title. You give us the subtitle and tell us what your book's about. Julia's recently published book is called The Grapes of Conquest.
And the subtitle is Race, Labor, and the Industrialization of California Wine, 1769 to 1920. And I'm elaborating a little.
Yes, please.
So many times when I share, I research on wine, at a party, I'll get a response like, I love wine, and, I was in Napa last year for the harvest, or I go to Sonoma every fall, and we have this romantic imagery of what California wine is. It's many times associated with elite and wealthy populations. My book is not about that. My book traces the origins of California wine within the conquest of California, beginning with the Spanish conquest, moving into the Mexican period, and then, of course, the American conquest. And I talk a lot about how race was made and challenged within the wine industry. I talk about the conquest of California natives and how wine was really a tool for their conquest and colonization. And again, moving in through the American period and ending with Prohibition.
Great, thank you. Joanne, captivating title, The Silver Women.
Okay. The Silver Women, How Black Women's Labor Made the Panama Canal. So the book is a kind of roundabout history of the Panama Canal, right? A story that I think people understand primarily as a story of U.S. empire and U.S. technocratic power, and then maybe secondarily as a story of labor. The canal was mostly built by migrant Black West Indian Caribbean labor. But my book tells the story of the Black West Indian women who also came along and really created the entire support system that upheld the construction of the Panama Canal. For various reasons that you can read about in the book. It was really Black women who intervened and were able to provide a host of services, in particular food, laundry, domestic service, et cetera, that really made the construction of the canal possible. But the book also explores how these same women really challenged the moral and economic parameters that the canal authorities tried to set upon the migrant labor force. So just to explain the title a little bit, one of these ways that the canal authorities tried to regulate the labor force is that they divided workers, they racially segregated them, but instead of calling it black and white, they called it gold and silver. So white Americans were paid in gold-backed American dollars and could enter spaces that were labeled as gold, whereas black workers were labeled silver and were paid in silver Colombian pesos or Panamanian balboas, and could only enter segregated spaces marked as silver. So I'm interested in silver women, that is, black women who were inevitably subject to the racial segregation of the gold and silver system, but also interested in how they, as uncontracted workers, were able to kind of skirt that system, right, and really navigate it in interesting ways.
Fabulous. Can you give us the chronological brackets of your work?
Of course. So the construction of the canal was 1904 to 1914, just that decade, and my book mostly focuses in on around that time.
Great. Thank you very much. Alex, The Spoils of Dust.
Reinventing the Lake That Made Los Angeles is the subtitle. The lake, this book is a kind of, you could, in its most sensational terms, consider it a sequel to the movie Chinatown. So this is dealing with the aftermath of the aqueduct that fed Los Angeles and made it into the metropolis that it is today. And what happened when we took the water from this valley 300 miles from here, we ended up draining a giant lake, the fourth largest in California. That eventually became this giant source of dust. And the city of Los Angeles had to go back and fix it. So my book is really about how we managed to fix this lake, make it into a pretty amazing world-class habitat, control all the dust which was coming off the lake, and still sort of have the water, have our cake as well. So it's really about how do we navigate this middle ground in terms of managing our environments, our landscapes. How do we extract all the resources we need, for instance, from the Owens Valley and still ameliorate all the damage that we do? So it's really a book about like how do we navigate in the future, in the Anthropocene, and sort of find a middle ground and build middle ground landscapes. But it's also about water, the value of water. It's about lakes. It's about perception and experience. And it also includes a section where I sort of imagine how you might design these things and experiment with new methodologies for design.
And does the book, for the audience, how far, does it go back to Mulholland and the construction of the aqueduct, or is it mostly, say, post-1970?
It's mostly post-1980-ish, and it's a very contemporary, granular history in part about like how they made this lake, how they kind of totally improbably made this bargain lake that's able to be kind of like a drought-tolerant, water-efficient lake so that has incredible bird habitat, but uses very little water and sort of balances all of these issues.
Thank you. Joanne, I'm going to turn to you. Why did you tackle this topic? And just the way you described the work and the communities you're most interested in, the daunting challenge of doing the research is just so palpable and obvious. Why this project, and how do you research it?
Yeah, two big questions. So the project, I actually started this project as an undergraduate student, if any of you guys are out there. So, you know, I chose the topic when I was 19 years old, and it just happened to be something I could write a whole book about 15 years later. So I got very lucky with that. But part of the reason I chose it is because I was born in Venezuela. I lived there most of my life. And around the time that I was an undergrad, when I had recently moved to the US, the migrant crisis from Venezuela really started to pick up. People might not know this, but at the time, Panama was one of the few countries where there was visa-free entry for Venezuelans. So it was one of the first places where a lot of migrants from Venezuela left to at the beginning of the crisis. And indeed, a lot of my family ended up there. It's kind of our second home now. So when I was trying to think of a topic to write my undergraduate thesis about, I was like, what would be interesting to write about in Panama, right? I mean, I'm just trying to remember what I was thinking when I was 19. I was a Black Studies major. I was very committed to thinking about radical traditions in Latin America and how they connected to race. So I was really invested in those topics then. as I am now, and wanted to think about the problematic of why Black women play such a small part in the way we tell the story of radical traditions, and wanted to think about why that was. So that's how I got started on the topic way long ago. And part of the process of turning it from, just an undergraduate idea to the book it is today is precisely the research process. It is shocking to me still that every book published in the US about the Panama Canal, and even most books published in Panama about the history of the Panama Canal, have never used the archives at the National Archives of Panama. Oh. And you're like, what? Why doesn't that seem like obvious? But I guess not. Multiple reasons for that, which we can discuss if people have Q&A questions. But my point being that, indeed, it is kind of an undertaking, and part of it is the allure of the amount of documentation that the U.S. created about the Panama Canal, right? So if you go to the National Archives of the U.S., there's just endless and endless and endless boxes about the construction, right? I mean, you would love it. So much about, like, dust and dredging and stuff. I was like, I don't know what that is. Sorry. So I used some of that, but also went to Panama and went to the Caribbean and went to London because, of course, these were colonies in the Caribbean, and tried to really triangulate the role of women by looking at all these different unique spaces where they were, coming from and going to.
Awesome. And 15 years ago as an undergraduate, it's not that long ago, there was no chance you could have met anyone that was elderly who had worked on it, is there?
No, not anybody who had actively worked on the construction, but I have met many descendants, and actually West Indian Panamanians and descendants of canal workers are very, very active in protecting and safeguarding the memory of their ancestors. I talk about one group quite a lot in my book, actually. It's this group that was founded by a West Indian Panamanian woman, Mrs. Frances Yearwood, who founded a preservation foundation for the racially segregated Black cemeteries in Panama. There are 3 of them. When the U.S. leaves Panama, the American Battle Monuments Commission takes charge of the cemeteries where white Americans were buried, but the cemeteries where Black workers were buried were left in this kind of intermediate state, right? So the U.S. is not taking care of them, but neither is Panama because it's perceived as kind of U.S. territory. And so they're left in, total disarray, and a lot of the graves are unidentified except by employee number. So this group of descendants has done the really hard work of trying to identify graves, find families and connect them, and preserve oral histories of people who lived in the U.S. Canal Zone, not during construction, but after, that are still alive.
Wow, thank you. Julia, this book started off as your dissertation. Can you tell the audience what other dissertation topic or topics you grappled with before you hit upon this one? And then tell us about doing what is also quite extraordinarily difficult research into the labor within the vineyards.
So I started graduate school here at USC thinking I was going to write about 20th century Mexican migrant workers. And that was because of my own family's history. Grandfathers, great-grandfathers, great-uncles were all braceros between the 40s and the early 60s. And I just grew up with their stories. I grew up hearing my grandmother share about, seeing her father and brothers leave, not knowing if they would come back. So that's what I thought I was going to write about. But as I started my graduate studies, I found myself fascinated by 19th century California, the rapid change, the political changes, the complexities of race, what happens when groups from all over the world migrate into a relatively small space and meet and interact. And as I was grappling with those questions, I learned through my mother, that Chinese migrant workers had labored in the wine industry and never had heard that before, despite growing up adjacent to California's wine industry up in Northern California. I literally had toured the tunnels that Chinese men had dug in the 19th century, but no one had ever mentioned that to me, and it wasn't in the books I was reading. So I took that interest, turned it into a seminar paper, and it became my dissertation, and now it's my book. In terms of the archival research, I think what Bill said is absolutely true. We historians are left with the question of interpreting what's left in the archives, right? And who builds the archives? It's often whoever's in power. And California natives were not in power when the Franciscan colonizers created documents that would become the archive that I studied. Same with Chinese workers, same with Mexican or Sonoran migrant workers who came in the 19th century. So to tease out that experience, much probably like studying women's history, in the 18th and early 19th century, it's a lot of reading between the lines. So for me, that meant sitting in the archives up at Santa Barbara, at the Mission Archive Library, and reading what the Franciscans left behind and reading, seeing where California natives were challenging their authority through messing with the crop system or stealing or making their own wine, for example. So just trying to find evidence of their side of the story. It's not easy to do, but it's fun. We're detectives.
So, Julia, let's go back to the Chinese workers for a second. Those are they railroad workers who are put out of work by the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, or are they brought from China explicitly to work in the vineyards?
That's a great question. When we see Chinese workers in the vineyards, it's in the early 1870s. So by and large, they're coming off the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869, and then they need work. And this is a time when American growers are expanding vineyards, so there was ample work for them, and they were able to take, their skill with dynamite and use it in the vineyards and wineries to blast out those tunnels.
And does the vineyard work throughout the latter third of the 19th century have the same kind of segregated and segmented labor like the Panama Canal, like stiff segregation amongst the workers?
Absolutely. So much like your people, my people in my book don't interact with each other. And this was a common strategy that growers employed. They didn't want people making friends with each other, right? A Mexican and a Chinese worker or a California native, because they might collaborate against the employer. So they would separate them. They wouldn't live together. They would make different wages for the same amount of work. So there's a lot of segregation happening in the vineyards.
Do you find the same genealogies of descendants that Joanne found? Is there a community of the descendants of migrant or other farm labor in the vineyards?
That's such a good question. And I haven't come across it. Doesn't mean it doesn't exist. But I do wonder if because the people I'm talking about are more 19th century laborers, if their descendants have maybe had a little bit more distance from this. It's not to say there aren't descendants and memorials and groups honoring the history of 19th century Chinese immigrant men, for example, or California natives. But I don't see the intersection between those historical groups and the wine industry.
Got it. So, Alex, let's go back to you and the Spoils of Dust. Why that project?
Project also was a result of proximity to some extent. I was fascinated by the Owens Valley. I loved the Owens Valley, and it was so much fun to work on this project in terms of the research. I had the best time. I was interested in infrastructure and, actually going back to the Panama Canal, like I remember reading about the Panama Canal and that this famous architect's son, Olmsted, visited the Panama Canal, and they were consulting. They were like, what should we do with the Panama Canal? How should we design this Panama Canal? Is it something we can do to improve it? And he was like, there's nothing you can do to improve this. This is a work of art. You've done a great job. We're not going to add trees along the edge of it. And so for me, that was interesting to think like, what can we do to infrastructure? Can landscape architects design infrastructure? Can they have any role? And when I drive up to the Sierras or to Mammoth Mountain, I would pass by the Owens Lake and see the dust control project that was happening there. And it was just like this perverse grid of roads that seemed like no one had designed it for anything. It just didn't make any sense. So I was interested in like going out there with my students, and we would try to figure out if we could design this dust control infrastructure. And we worked with the local air pollution control district there. I found out that they had this amazing archive. They had been taking photographs of dust, like they had and they had all these different tools, and they were just improvising, trying to figure out how to make dust perceptible, and they were doing plein air drawings of it with like up in pickup trucks with their clipboards and triangulating it. So I just was fascinated by all the process that was happening there, and I was going to the community meetings, and I ended up getting funding to do a kind of an experimental project where I started modeling the designs for the Owens Lake using a robotic arm in sand. And I was working with this architect who had this incredible ability to work with robotics, and we would model different versions of the lake bed with sand, and then we had like a projected information on it, and we created eventually a whole video game where you could go inside of the Owens Lake, design the parameters, change how much water you're using. It would use the habitat model that they were using there. You could sort of figure out like an optimal design, and then you could we eventually made a version where it printed out a postcard that was this memento and this kind of vision of the future that was a talisman of what could be. And so I did this project, and I just kind of plowed into this project, and I got a fellowship to go to Rome for a year, and I spent half the fellowship doing nothing related to the Owens Valley, and then eventually my advisors were like, you need a book to get tenure. That's another part of the job. And I was like, okay, let's write the book about the Owens Lake. So I just went into the basement of my fellowship's library and didn't emerge until I came back. And then I got a van, a VW camper van, and I would drive out to the lake and camp out on the lake and write the book while I was taking panoramic 18-hour panoramic photos of the lake, because I wanted to know what kind of landscape this was, like understand it in a way that I needed to, I thought to redesign it. So I would, and then the guys that maintained it, they would just wave at me, and they were like, okay, we don't know what you're doing here, but you seem relatively innocuous. And I wrote my book, a lot of the manuscript out there. So anyway, this is kind of a longer story about why I think I loved. I mean, there's greater motivations, but part of it was just a really exciting thing to work on, and there was so much opportunity and a big opening, I thought, in terms of finding this kind of new way forward with designing places like this. And I like this process of diving into a project and helping work on the design, and then going back and doing the kind of book research. And it's something I'm doing on the Elliott River now.
And you were awarded tenure.
Yes, I was. Yeah. Thank you.
So what Joanne and Julia's books share quite obviously is a theme about landscapes of conquest and the indigeneity and the repression and suppression of indigenous peoples. How about you? How about the Paiute? And you interact with them, and what's the role these days in making sense of that lake bed with indigenous partners or antagonists?
That was probably one of the greatest omissions, that I never found a way to, very effectively interact. The Paiute had a very clear and I think a lot of respect for that position as well, but they had a very clear perspective on what should happen. They said the lake should be restored to its original watered state. And so they also were very concerned with the archaeological evidence and artifacts on the lake. And so it wasn't, because it's such an active project, I wasn't allowed to even talk about that part of it. And except for I'd find and I mentioned some of the things, some of the regulations and laws were related to a massacre that happened at a certain part of the lake bed's shoreline. So they have evidence, and they were actually litigating that as a way to kind of change where the border of the lake was. But so the Paiute had a very clear idea of what they wanted, and that sort of lay outside of the political reality of the moment. So it wasn't a key part of the book.
Thank you. So, Alex, in your professional life, you are probably the closest of any of us up here about defining and bringing into your research this concept that's our title today, placemaking, which it's a very attractive word, but what it means is a little slipperier. What does placemaking mean for you professionally or even in the lake bed? And then for our next panelists, what's placemaking about your place, your book?
Well, placemaking has a history, a sort of history in terms of landscape architecture. When I was in school, it was about putting a cafe in a park. That's how you made a place. And I think there's
Seriously?
Yeah, that was like the People for Public Spaces was like, basically they did a lot of research and they determined that like you need a cafe in a park. And of course you need more than that. But that was sort of like, pilloried for a while. I think that there is actually a lot of wisdom and there, if you look deeper into it, but I'm not an expert in that part of it. I think that for me, the placemaking that I work on more specifically is the fact that infrastructure, which is comes from this idea of the gravel underneath the railroad, underneath the rails, the sort of substructure idea. Infrastructure is the substructure or the scaffolding for our life. That infrastructure is now it's the way where we live. We live inside infrastructure. We live on streets. We spend time at the LA River, even though it's just a concrete channel. There's a lot of people bicycling there and having life experiences there, or creating art. So the things that were not designed to be our places are now our places. And so I'm interested in saying well, what kind of place are what is this place that we've never really thought about as a place? We've all just the freeway is not a place, but maybe a freeway has now become a park, like the High Line. This is something that now is part of the fabric of our life. So we have to rethink when we design these things. How do we actually think about them as places? So that's something that I investigate both by looking at these things and then trying to design new ways that we can design something that's technical as a flood control infrastructure while also making it a place, while thinking about its qualities aesthetically, experientially, socially, culturally, and ecologically.
Thank you. Joanne, placemaking, Panama Canal, maybe even these remarkably poignant stories about the cemeteries.
Yeah, I mean, I think the lesson, the takeaway from my book, right, is about how people manage to create conditions of possibility and of survival under extreme conditions of exclusion, right? They're unwanted migrants in this place for the most part. They do not have legal status in U.S. territory nor in Panamanian territory. They are themselves only, one generation away from emancipation in the Caribbean, where they live on exactly the same plantation land under the same family that owned their ancestors, right? So how do you make place in that, under those conditions, which across nation states, right, are trying to bind you as disposable labor? And yet still, they managed to do it, right? And I think we can see it both historically in the ways that women really tried to maintain West Indian communities, particularly through their legal interactions with these states. And we can certainly see it today in the projects of descendants, both in things like this cemetery preservation project. There's also a small West Indian Panamanian museum in Panama City that is exceptional. And what was the other one I was going to mention? Now I don't remember. But there are kind of multiple projects, right, of memory making and preservation and placemaking, indeed, that is not only happening in Panama, right, but again, across nations, across imperial borders as well, showing again how placemaking doesn't quite have to be tied to just this one place, right? But for diaspora, it's always a kind of multi-sided project.
And driven or maybe sustained and nurtured by resilience and pain?
Yeah, I mean, of course. Although sometimes there is resilience, there is pain, there is also joy and love and kinship and family, and fun, You know, there's also a lot of
Life.
right, exactly, a lot of life.
Yeah, thank you. Julia, placemaking.
I think in the context of the California wine industry, which is still very much alive and vibrant today, even though, you know, the numbers show wine consumption is lower, it's still around today and still important. And there are communities that have very strong claims to the heritage of the wine industry today. I'm thinking specifically about Italian American Californians whose work has absolutely been fundamental to its growth in the 20th century. So if I'm thinking about placemaking with wine, I'm thinking about it in two different ways. One, expanding and broadening our understanding of what and where California wine was grown. I'm thinking of Anaheim, which literally was founded as a wine growing colony by German immigrants to California. So expanding the boundaries of where California wine is or was beyond Napa and Sonoma, Temecula, or the Central Coast, and looking at places and peeling back the layers of land use over time and seeing like, gosh, there were grapevines in downtown Los Angeles. What does that mean? What does that mean? The other area is about communities and who can claim ownership of the wine industry. One of the arguments I make towards the end of my book is that California wine is not just Italian Americans. Are Italian Americans important to the 20th century wine industry? Absolutely. But they did not build this industry from the ground up. They expanded on vines that were literally planted in the ground by California natives and Chinese immigrants, among others. And, I mentioned Germans. There were other European working class groups that worked in the vineyards, Mexican migrants, etc. So what does it mean when we have all of these different groups working in what I would argue is California's most storied agricultural industry? Can they lay a claim to that space? What does it mean when we, in the 21st century, United States and California, are turning our proverbial shoulders away from immigrants while an industry relies on migrant workers to come up every year from Mexico to work the harvest, right? These are temporary workers who come up on a visa to work the harvest, and it's very skilled labor. They're incredibly important to making sure we can all enjoy our Chardonnay with dinner. So I think that's part of it too. People who can lay a claim to this important industry and the product it produces.
Thank you. Let's do a little thought exercise up here with the three of you, if you could, and build a time machine for a second. Let's pick roughly 1900, because there's some chronological commonalities in your work. And if you could go to your place, I mean, right now with your scholar goggles on, take us to your place around that time. What does it look like? You've got all the expertise to see it in your mind's eye of 130, 125 years ago. What's it look like? What's it sound like? What's the picture that's painted in front of your eyes? Alex?
I love this question. Let's go back to Lone Pine, which is right next to the Owens Lake, and this is a little town, a little sleepy town. And I'm not a historian, so I'm going to make a little bit making this up, but so it's a sleepy town, an agricultural community. And there's this kind of one road going right through it, a dusty road. It has some flooding, so there's tall boardwalks on both sides. There's a small, there's a small farming community that's there, and they're kind of in the middle of the nowhere, but they're in this incredible backdrop of the giant Sierra Mountains right behind them. And then on the other side, they have the Inyo Mountains. It's one of the deepest valleys in the U.S. And then they're adjacent to this giant watery expanse. It's a 100 square mile lake. And the lake has been described by this ecologist from Berkeley, Joseph Grinnell, who would visit the lake, and he would look at all the birds along the edge of this lake, and it was just an incredible sight that he would try to compute how many birds were living on this lake. And it would kind of blow his mind, and he would took some original pictures of the lake and just tried to describe in this incredible verbiage the quantity of life there. And on the edge, there's tules and all sorts of little rivulets of water that the Paiute would dam and create different kind of crop conditions, and they would harvest the flies that would grow on the edge of the salt lake that would breed there. They would harvest it in these giant bushels and save them for winter food stuff. So it was this, and there was lots of, it was smelly, and there was lots of death because the lake was receding and falling and rising and creating these pockets of putrid water where the fish and other animals would kind of die and decompose. It was just full of life, full of death in this spectacular place, and just like this lake that that stretched from here to San Fernando Valley, a gigantic expanse. So, and if you want to hear more about what it was like, I really recommend Mary Austin's book, The Land of Little Rain, which is a beautiful book that was written about that time, about that place, and one of the best pieces of nature writing I've ever read.
Thank you. Julia, take us somewhere and tell us what you see and hear.
I'm thinking Southern California. My book is largely about Los Angeles and its surrounding settlements and colonies and missions, because that's where the wine industry originated. And if you're wondering, well, why don't we tour vineyards in downtown LA today, or in Anaheim, mid 1880s, terrible disease, grape blight, swept through the Southland, beginning in Anaheim and spreading up to the San Gabriel Valley, San Marino, Pasadena, where there were a lot of vineyards. So by 1900, the wine industry and grape cultivation in this area was dead. And we had millions of grapevines that had to be uprooted because there was just no doing with this disease. It's called Pierce's disease, and it's still around today. If you mention the glassy wing sharpshooter, it'll strike fear in the heart of wine growers today. So this is a period of transition for Southern California to citrus. So that's what I'm envisioning here. It's, the foothills in the San Gabriel Valley, looking up and seeing little orange trees and lemon trees, and seeing that in Anaheim as well and across Orange County instead of vineyards.
Thank you. Joanne.
This is a complicated question because, and I'm going to take you to 1904 instead of 1900, because that's when the U.S. arrives in Panama, right? And as the U.S. tells the story of what this landscape looks like, it's that of virgin jungle, untouched rainforest, right? Land that is not being used productively by Panamanians. That's how the U.S. positions it, right? So most accounts of the area that becomes the Panama Canal are actually very invested in the description of landscape, even though this is in fact an area that is actually one of the denser parts of Panama. Panama has a very low population, but this is probably the densest part of Panama at the time. It had also been the site where the French had tried to build a canal 30 years earlier. So again, not untouched land in any way, shape, or form, which they knew, right? But part of the project of U.S. empire, part of the project of claiming this land as something that they should be the ones to, create into this technological marvel, was to position it as an untouched landscape, right? In fact, it looks like a mix of these things. There is tropical rainforest, immense biodiversity, as there continues to be in the Isthmus of Panama, as well as indigenous people, mestizo and Afro-descendant Panamanians who lived there, who had created their own kind of political organizations there at the time. It's also a place that's undergoing massive change demographically, right? So 1904 marks the arrival of the US, but it also marks the arrival of migrant labor, which just in that first year triples the population of Panama, just the arrival of migrant labor, right? So we're seeing, it's really an era of massive change, but not from a past that was static.
Right, thank you. I'm going to invite you all, if you have questions, you can just come up. I have a couple more questions for our panel, but just in interest of time, because we've got 15 minutes left. If you have questions and you're on that side of the room, if you could come over there, and if you're on this side of the room, you can come over here. We'll get to you in just a minute. I want to ask our panelists, do you have an ideal reader or an audience for whom you wrote this book? And if you say, my grandma, that's fine. But what audience are you trying to hit, and what are you working on now? Julia.
I wrote the book as a historian working at a university, right, for my career. We have to write a book to stay and keep our jobs. So, when I proposed it, it was other historians, students of California and the West, graduate students in particular. But my dream reader is the public. It's people who enjoy wine, smart, intelligent people who are curious about the state we live in, the layers of land use, who's occupied our communities before we did, but especially wine lovers, to just be a little curious about who is behind bringing us that bottle that we just pick up at the grocery store, or that the fancier among us have delivered to our homes, right? Whose work made that possible in bringing it to our tables?
Thank you. One quick follow-up question on the way you answered the earlier question about the removal of the vineyards because of the disease and the implantation of all the citrus here in Southern California. Those vineyard workers go right into citrus?
Many of them do, yeah.
Okay. Alex, Julia, what are you working on now? Sorry.
Well, if you'd asked me 6 months ago, I would have said, wine and I have been together for a long time. It's time for us to break up and move apart. But I'm still on it. I'm still hooked. So I'm looking at now prohibition and post-prohibition wine in California, and looking at this strange industry that tried to claim that they were simple farmers who could sell their products to people directly, just like tomato farmers do or strawberry farmers do at the side of the road, yet also wanted to be exempt from government regulation and labels and product requirements. So I'm just very fascinated by this food/alcohol/ we're not sure what we are industry and its relationship to the government and the people. So I don't know where that's going to go.
Great, thank you. Alex, ideal reader, and what are you working on now?
My ideal reader was someone who would love to go to the Center for Land Use Interpretation in Los Angeles, which no one may know about, but sort of obscure, people who are nerds about land and landscape. Like people who, and not just national parks. I love nature and national parks, but also a mine or something, some sort of, use of land. The project I'm working on right now is a laboratory to help us combine, focused on the Los Angeles River, that helps us design the Los Angeles River, that combining engineering, landscape architecture, and community engagement. And I have built, and Bill's visited, I have built with my team a 60-foot long hydraulic model of the Los Angeles River, of a section of the river, and it has running water running through it, and we have an augmented reality system, and we're starting to have more public events where we're going to bring people in and redesign the river using all these, putting together the technical part of it, the engineering part of it, with the artistic part of it. So we're trying to put all those pieces together and make a really beautiful river that is going to be something that we're proud of, and hopefully reinvent how we design infrastructure.
Terrific. Joanne, reader, and we'll do you, and then we'll turn to questions. Okay. Yeah, reader and what you're working on these days.
Okay. Reader, whoever wants to buy the book, that's great. I can give you a discount code.
The Silver Women.
Yeah. But it has been great to share my book. I've presented my book in lots of different places, and it's always fun to go somewhere that I think is kind of random, and inevitably in the Q&A, somebody will raise their hand and say, I'm West Indian, and my ancestor worked at the Panama Canal, and that is the best. It is the best feeling. And then what am I working on now? After you finish your first book, your top priority is to sleep for a year. But my new project is exploring the conflicts that have prompted the sort of impending war between Venezuela and Guyana over the border region there, and thinking about the conflicts over indigenous sovereignty and black migrant labor and gold mining extraction in the 19th century that kind of created that border to begin with. Yep.
Fabulous. Thank you. Okay, let's turn to questions. We've got at least one or two over here and then one or two over here. So please, and if you could direct your question to one of the panelists, or if it's for all of them, just say, I'd like to hear what you all say. Please.
Hello, my name is Kadar Al-Raza. My question is, often my generation younger perceive history as confined to the past, as if it were a distance and disconnected from the current political climate. Can each of you discuss the significance of your studies, research, and books, and explain how that relates to the contemporary political landscape, and most importantly, how can this generation actively participate and contribute to the current and future placemaking efforts that reshape our communities?
Excellent question. So I think you probably all heard that. The contemporary relevance of our historical studies. Does history matter? And if so, how does it matter to contemporary concerns, particularly of younger generations? Who would like to tackle it first? Go for it.
Thank you. That's the only question. You know what I mean? That's the question that I think about every day. In some ways, I don't feel like I even have to make an effort to teach my students about how to connect my work or what we learn in the classroom to the current political climate. They make those connections immediately. The moment we talk about US empire, the moment we talk about racial segregation, the moment we talk about land dispossession, like, they're ready to go, you know what I mean? Like, they're making those connections themselves. And so I often feel like I'm not even having to teach them that, right? Like, I just give them the tools to be able to make evidence-based claims, and then we're already all like rolling forward and seeing those connections, right? So hopefully that means that we're all like making sense of how history matters to our everyday already. I guess I will say, like, I always keep that at the forefront of my teaching, and certainly with my research as well, which, you know, I tried to mention that in several of my answers. To me, this is a project that is so connected to descendants and their projects of placemaking right now, right? I always tell people that the argument of my book about West Indian women's importance to the Panama Canal was not something I came up with. This is something that every descendant has been saying for decades, right? I just happened to put it in a book. But if you ask a West Indian and you tell them, oh, did you know that West Indian women like worked in the Panama Canal? They'd be like, yeah, are you stupid? Right? Like, people who are on the ground like know this already. And our work as historians is to work collaboratively to really kind of change the notion of whose knowledge matters as we go forward in this collective project of like making the world better.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Other of you?
Yeah, I wanted to say just ditto. I have the privilege of working with really smart, curious students. And I know that's not the narrative about Gen Z in the newspapers, but that's not what I see in the classroom. And it's just about opening the window to the past and just immersing ourselves in that world. And they literally, the light bulbs go off and they're like, this is like what we're talking about right now with closing the borders, or this is what we're talking about with, I could go on and on and on and on. They're making those connections on their own just by reading the textbooks and exploring primary sources, the archive, what's left to us from the past. In terms of my own work, I see this book as just doing a small part in claiming a space for immigrants. We are not new to California. We're not new to the United States, but I'm talking about our state here locally. We've been here a long time, and our work, our labor, helped build this state. And I think it's important to literally just say, hey, these folks have been here a long time, and their work has made it possible for us to do X, Y, Z. Immigrants are not new.
Thank you. Alex?
I would say that's an awesome question, and I think that for the work that I do, which is more contemporary history, one thing I really teach my students, or we discover looking at it, is there's such a vacuum of vision and kind of a holistic perspective on a lot of these subjects, that there's just so much opportunity and need for their involvement. And then the other thing that we often find is there's the improbable ways in which people have power in these places, and how artists and people just going for a walk can have so much power over a place, and just actually just being in a place and participating has so much power. And so I really think there's, I try to empower them, and I think history really tells that story very well.
Great. Let's go over here, and if we can keep our answers crisp, which you did, not a criticism, we'll get all the questions.
This is a question for Joanne. I was just curious. I know there's a Afro-Panamanian community here in LA, and I wondered if you had built bridges from the academy to the community.
I know. I only learned about that as I moved. I'm not from the West Coast at all. So once I moved to LA, I was like, oh my God, that's so unique. Yeah, and I've met a handful of them. There are, but now, of course, I'm going to not remember the names of the top of my head. Janelle something. These two great journalists, writers who are Afro-Panamanian who I've worked with before, and I invite them to events. And trying to kind of get into. I never imagined that the West Coast would be a place where the Panama Canal would come to play, and I feel like I'm only beginning to realize those connections now.
Great.
Appreciate it.
Let's go over here.
Thanks. Thank you so much for a great panel. Professor Robinson, I am really interested in the Salton Sea from spending time in the Coachella Valley and in the desert, which seems like a much darker past, present, and future than Owens Lake. And just wonder if you have any information about the Salton Sea or any hope that or anything to say about that sort of sad, dark story.
I don't have that much to say about the Salton Sea. To add to what you just said, and you've encapsulated it well. It's a dark situation, and I don't know what the answer is.
I'll add just one thing, that in some respects, in terms of labor segmentation and the people of Julia's project from the 18th and 19th century, that migrant community of diversity and lower working class labor is going out there for lithium mining. So that's the thing to keep in mind and keep an eye on, I think. Excellent question. Yes.
Hi. Thank you so much for sharing your time and your research and experiences. I just wanted to ask all of you, in your research, what have you found the importance of names in placemaking when it comes to how we interpret places and how also we create them?
Great question. In the commemorative landscape. In a commemorative landscape of names on the landscape, or what things are called by the communities that live there.
Exactly. So how cultures create things. So Owens Lake, and I'm assuming the indigenous communities had another name for Owens Lake, or even something like the Panama Canal in a predominantly Spanish-speaking country. We call it the Panama Canal, and so.
Great question, panelists. I mean, placemaking is naming, right? And so names are culturally variable. So what in your work have you encountered in terms of the power of naming that is contested?
I mean, I can say something, but it's actually about my new project, not about the Panama Canal. But it is very, very relevant to this question. So I'll try to be brief about it. The land between the Orinoco and the Essequibo rivers in the Amazon, it's called the land of many rivers. Every river, almost every place name in the region is indigenous. It's usually Warao or Carib, which is a kind of misnomer. That's not a real kind of tribal designation, or not how people self-identify, but it's in any case. It's interesting to look back at the history of place names in the Amazon and see the really significant indigenous presence throughout that is evidenced by these place names, right? Not just by the, of course, real presence of indigenous people there, but how much that landscape is absolutely defined by indigenous knowledge and indigenous knowledge of waterways in a way that is still the case. You meet people sometimes from Venezuela and Guyana who live in the capital cities who don't know how to pronounce anything in the Amazon. And I think that's a testament, again, to how deeply this place has been marked by indigenous presence, which I think it's still powerfully evidenced by those names. Yeah.
Good answer. Do we have one more question over here? Okay, Julia, you want to tackle that one?
I think when you mention place names, I'm going to latch on to names. Because in the wine industry, if you've ever gone up to Napa, Sonoma, many wineries will have a small little, a walk through history or the past. And it's a small pseudo public history exhibit that you can enjoy while you taste wine. And it's always amazing to me to see whose names are attached to these places, these money makers, these tourist sites, these agricultural places, and who's excluded, and who the pioneer is, right? And what that means. So yeah, I'm thinking more people versus place names, but they're deeply, deeply attached to these places in Sonoma and Napa especially.
Great. We've come to the hour. It's very quick, I know. Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking our really wonderful panelists. So they'll be signing.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast and visit us at podcast.usc.edu.